I never imagined a single coin lying in the gutter could decide the rest of my life. It was just another tired walk home after a long shift, another stretch of cracked pavement beneath my feet, another sunset I barely noticed. But that day, the light caught something, a faint, stubborn glimmer, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I stopped. I didn't know it then, but that pause would lead me down a road I could never turn back from. The air that evening was heavy, almost humid, like the city itself was exhaling after a long day. Street lamps hadn't switched on yet, but the sun was sinking low, painting everything in a rich amber glow. The sidewalks were mostly empty, save for the occasional cyclist or dog walker passing by. My work bag felt heavier than usual, pressing into my shoulder, and I remember thinking only about the leftovers waiting in my fridge. That's when I saw it. A flash, tiny but insistent, caught the corner of my eye. I slowed, squinting toward the gutter where the pavement met the edge of the street. At first I thought it was just a bottle cap catching the light, but as I stepped closer, my breath caught. It was a coin, not the dull, ordinary kind you'd dig out of your pocket for a bus fare, but something far older, far more deliberate. Its gold surface was slightly tarnished, its edges smoothed with age, but still it gleamed as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it. The light from the setting sun hit it just right, making it look almost alive. I might have picked it up immediately, but something made me pause. Movement in my peripheral vision. An elderly woman was making her way toward the same spot. She wore a faded floral dress that fluttered faintly in the evening breeze, paired with a hand-knitted cardigan that looked worn, but clean. Her back was slightly bent, and she moved with the slow, cautious steps of someone who had learned to measure each movement carefully. In one hand, she carried a small fraying cloth bag. In the other, nothing but trembling fingers that now reached toward the coin. She bent forward, straining, but the coin was just beyond her reach. Her knees wobbled. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, then retreated slightly, as though she was gathering the courage to try again. Something in my chest tightened. Before my mind could fully register what I was doing, I stepped forward. My shoes crunched lightly against the grit on the pavement as I crouched down and picked up the coin. It was heavier than I expected, warm from the day's heat, but also oddly comforting against my palm. I gave it a quick brush with my thumb, clearing away a faint film of dust. When I looked up, she was watching me. Her eyes were unforgettable, deep brown, the kind of brown that holds stories in its depths, not just memories, but entire lifetimes. They were lined at the edges with fine wrinkles, but the intensity in them was as sharp as a knife. There was relief there, yes, but also something else. Something that made me feel as though she knew me, even though I was certain we had never met. I held out the coin to her. "Here," I said, my voice instinctively gentle. Her hand came forward slowly, trembling slightly. The moment my fingers released the coin into her palm, her grip closed around it with surprising strength, as though she feared it might disappear if she didn't hold on tight enough. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that didn't match the simplicity of the words. It was layered. Gratitude, yes, but also something heavier. Something like expectation. For a second, we simply stood there. The background noise of the street, the distant rumble of a bus, the faint clink of a bottle somewhere, seemed to fade, replaced by an odd stillness. It was like the rest of the world had taken a step back, leaving just the two of us suspended in that moment. I nodded politely, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. "No problem," I murmured, though it felt inadequate. I turned to walk away, my footsteps slow, my mind already wondering why that brief exchange felt so strange. But before I had taken more than a few steps, her voice reached me again, not loud, not urgent, but sharp enough to pierce the quiet between us. "I've been waiting for you," I froze mid-step. The words hung in the air, delicate and heavy all at once. My pulse picked up, and I turned slightly. just enough to see her still standing there, still holding the coin, her gaze locked on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Waiting for me. What could she possibly mean? I didn't know it then, but those words would haunt me for days. Until I saw her again. Her voice echoed in my mind as I walked away, each syllable carrying a strange, inexplicable weight. "I've been waiting for you." The sentence looped endlessly, refusing to fade. Some part of me, the part that usually ignored odd encounters, couldn't let it go. And that was how I found myself searching for her face again, without even knowing why. Some strangers fade from your memory. She only became sharper in mine. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange encounter I'd laugh about later. But every night, lying in bed with the city's hum outside my window, I'd hear her voice again. "I've been waiting for you." And each time, it left me with the unsettling sense that I'd stepped into a story I didn't understand. For the next few days, I tried to carry on like normal. I went to work, stood in endless lines for coffee, scrolled through meaningless posts on my phone, all the little distractions that are supposed to keep you from thinking too hard. But none of it worked. Her face kept finding me in quiet moments. The way her eyes had looked, deep, steady, knowing. The way her thin fingers had curled protectively around that coin. That odd stillness in the air, like the world had stepped back and left only the two of us standing there. By the third day, my thoughts had grown restless enough to spill into conversation. I brought it up to my best friend, Mia, during our usual Thursday coffee. We sat in the corner booth of our favorite cafe, the one with mismatched chairs and the faint smell of cinnamon. "She told you she's been waiting for you?" Mia repeated, setting her cup down with a faint clink. Okay, that's either the start of a fairy tale or a scam. I smirked at her bluntness, but my smile didn't last long. It didn't feel like either. There was something, I don't know, real about her. Mia raised an eyebrow. Real how? Real creepy? Or real I just met my long-lost grandmother? I laughed, shaking my head. Not creepy. Just like she knew me. Like she'd been expecting me. Mia leaned forward, her voice dropping conspiratorially. "If she invites you to some underground meeting of coin collectors, don't say I didn't warn you." We both laughed. But later, as I walked home, her words felt less like a joke and more like a dare. A week passed before I saw her again. It was a warm Saturday morning, and I'd gone to the market for fresh bread and fruit. The sun was already high enough to cast long streaks of gold between the buildings, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass. I decided to take the park route home. A longer walk, but shaded, and filled with the kind of quiet you can't buy in the city. The park was waking up slowly. A man jogged past with headphones. A mother pushed a stroller along the gravel path. A couple of kids chased each other around a fountain. Birds chattered in the branches overhead, and the wind stirred the leaves with a gentle hush. And then I saw her. She was sitting on a weathered green bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, its roots twisting into the earth like ancient veins. A paper bag rested in her lap, and she was scattering crumbs onto the ground for a gathering of pigeons. They pecked eagerly at her feet, unafraid, as though they'd known her for years. She wore the same faded floral dress and cardigan, I remembered, though in the dappled sunlight they seemed softer, almost delicate. Her hair was pinned loosely, a few silver strands escaping to frame her face. Something inside me stuttered. A hesitation. A pull. My feet slowed, my mind a swirl of questions. Should I approach her? Pretend I hadn't seen her? Before I could decide, she looked up. Her eyes found mine instantly, like they'd been tracking me long before I noticed her. A smile spread across her face, slow, deliberate, warm. "Hello, your name," she said. The sound of my name from her lips was like a small shock. My steps faltered. I searched my memory for any moment I might have told her, but there was nothing. The only words we'd exchanged last time were about the coin. How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Her smile didn't falter. Names are important. They tell you who someone is, and sometimes who they're meant to be. Before I could ask more, she patted the empty space beside her. Sit with me. I did, though not without a flicker of caution. The bench creaked softly under my weight, and for a moment we just sat there, the oak's shade cooling the air around us. Up close, I noticed the small details I'd missed before. The neat stitching repairing the cardigan's frayed cuffs, the faint lavender scent on her skin, the small pale scar near her left temple. She didn't start with small talk. Her first question came without hesitation. Do you live alone? The abruptness caught me off guard, but her tone was gentle, not invasive. I told her I had a small apartment, just me and a few too many houseplants. She nodded thoughtfully, then asked about my family, my work, my dreams, not casually, but with intent. It felt less like a conversation and more like a study. Every answer I gave seemed to confirm something for her, though she never explained what. Her gaze stayed steady on mine, unhurried but attentive, as though each word mattered. And strangely, I found myself telling her things I didn't usually share, about the volunteer work I'd done in college, the short stories I'd written but never shown anyone, the way I always tried to help strangers when I could, even if it was something small. Her lips curved into a knowing smile more than once, though she never interrupted. Eventually, the pigeons lost interest and wandered off. She crumpled the empty paper bag with careful hands, tucking it into her cardigan pocket. The shade had shifted slightly, sunlight now spilling across her shoes. I stood, certain our strange meeting was over. But she stayed seated, her hands resting neatly in her lap. Then, as if remembering something, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She held it out to me, her palm open. "Open this when you're ready," she said. The paper was warm from her touch, its edges worn, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times before. I took it slowly, sliding it into my jacket pocket without looking at it. But even without seeing what was inside, I felt its weight, not physical, but something else. As I walked away, the folded note seemed to press against my side like a heartbeat. Her voice, steady and deliberate, replayed in my mind. "Open this when you're ready." I didn't know why, but a part of me already understood. The moment I did, my life would no longer be the same. One note, one address. A doorway into the unknown. It lay in my jacket pocket like it had its own heartbeat, quiet but insistent, reminding me it was there. I told myself I'd wait a week before even looking at it, maybe even throw it away. But that night, I realized curiosity has a way of erasing common sense, and when I finally unfolded it, my world shifted, just a fraction, but enough to feel it. When I got home from the park, I tossed my keys on the counter and set my grocery bag on the table. The folded piece of paper sat in my palm for a moment before I slid it into my jacket pocket, telling myself I wouldn't look at it until I was ready. Only, ready was a strange word. Ready for what? For hours, I moved through my apartment like a sleepwalker. I reheated dinner but didn't taste it, half-watched a movie without following the plot. And all the while, I felt the note pressing against my side, as if it was waiting for me to notice it again. By midnight, I gave up pretending I could ignore it. I sat at my kitchen table, the only light coming from the small lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. My hands hesitated before unfolding it, my fingers running over the paper's texture. It wasn't cheap notebook paper. It was heavier, with faint crosshatch patterns like the kind used for formal letters. Whoever had written on it had cared enough to choose something that would last. I opened it. The handwriting was beautiful. Elegant loops and deliberate strokes, each letter perfectly balanced. I imagined the woman sitting at a desk, writing it slowly, as though each word mattered. It read, "Tea tomorrow, 3 o'clock. My home." Beneath the words was an address I didn't recognize. I read it again and again, as if repetition might unlock a hidden meaning. It didn't. In the morning, I showed it to Mia over coffee. She stared at it, then at me. "You're not actually going, are you?" she asked, eyebrows raised. "I haven't decided," I lied. Mia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. This is how people end up in documentaries. She was a kind soul, until she trusted the wrong stranger. I rolled my eyes, but she wasn't smiling. "At least tell me where you're going, if you do. Send me your location." "Promise." "I promise," I said, even though I already knew I was going. Because beneath all the doubt, all the warnings, there was a pull I couldn't explain. Something about her. The way she knew my name, the way she spoke like she'd been expecting me, made it impossible to walk away. The next day, I left early. The weather was cool but sunny, the kind of day where light glints off every surface. The bus ride took me to the edge of the city, where streets narrowed and houses stood farther apart. The address led me to a quiet lane at the far edge of town, where the road turned to gravel, and the sound of traffic faded into the chirping of unseen birds. Her house was small, single-story, painted pale green that had faded over the years. The front garden was overgrown in places, weeds curling between bursts of late-season flowers. But the windows shone as if they'd been cleaned that morning, catching the light like clear water. I stood at the gate for a moment, gripping the strap of my bag. The place looked both ordinary and strange, like a house that wanted to blend in but couldn't hide what it was. Before I could knock, the door opened. She stood there, the same cardigan draped over her shoulders, a fresh floral dress beneath it. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, catching the sunlight, and she wore that same small, knowing smile. "You came," she said, her voice warm but without surprise. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the scent of fresh tea and cinnamon. It felt instantly safe. Too safe, maybe, like the kind of comfort that hides something underneath. The living room was modest, but filled with carefully chosen things. Antique vases stood in the corners, their colors muted, but rich. A row of old clocks lined the mantel, each ticking in soft, steady rhythm. Paintings of forests and oceans hung in polished frames, and the wooden floors gleamed underfoot. She led me into a small dining room. A round table was set for two, a porcelain teapot at its center, steam curling upward in thin, lazy ribbons. The cups beside it were delicate, patterned in blue and gold, each with a matching saucer. A plate of biscuits sat nearby, dusted with sugar, still warm enough to release a faint, buttery scent. "Please," she said, motioning to the chair opposite hers. I sat, the wood creaking faintly under my weight. She poured the tea with steady hands, the amber liquid filling the cup in a slow, even stream. The smell was stronger now, mingling with the cinnamon in the air. We sipped in silence at first. The warmth of the tea seeped into my hands through the porcelain, calming me in spite of the questions buzzing in my head. Finally I asked, "Why did you invite me here?" Her gaze met mine over the rim of her cup. "Because there are things you need to see. Things you need to understand." Her voice was calm, deliberate, the kind of tone that made you feel the words before you processed them. She reached for a biscuit, broke it in half, and placed one piece gently on my saucer. The gesture felt strangely ceremonial, like she was offering more than just food. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock somewhere nearby. My eyes roamed again over the space, the polished furniture, the spotless glass, the way every object seemed to have a history. This wasn't the home of someone who lived carelessly. When I looked back at her, she was studying me the way she had in the park, not just looking, but reading, as though my face itself was giving her answers. I opened my mouth to press her, to demand she tell me what this was all about. But something in her expression stopped me. This wasn't a conversation I could rush. Whatever she planned to say, it would come when she was ready. And only then. She set her cup down with a soft clink, leaning slightly forward, her eyes locking on mine. "Nothing here is as it seems," she said, her voice low but steady. The words hung in the air, heavy, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just tea. This was the start of something I couldn't walk away from. Every sip felt like she was slowly unwrapping a secret she had kept for years. There was something deliberate in the way she held her cup, the way she looked at me between sips, like she was measuring what I did with every moment. Her words weren't rushed. They landed carefully, like coins being placed in a neat, deliberate stack. And I began to realize this meeting had been planned long before I ever held that coin in my hand. She began by thanking me again for returning it. Her tone was polite, but not casual, the way one might thank someone for saving a life. That was more than kindness, she said. It was the way she said it that unsettled me. Not the words themselves, but the weight she put behind them, as though she was speaking about something larger than the moment we'd shared in the street. I tried to wave it off. It was nothing, really. Just a coin. Her eyes didn't waver. Nothing is just anything. Not if you look closely enough. The tea was warm in my hands, fragrant with something floral I couldn't quite place. Steam curled up in thin threads, catching the afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains. The room itself was cozy, the kind of warmth that made you want to sink into it. Yet something in the air felt charged, like a conversation waiting to happen. Her next question came without warning. If you suddenly had more than you needed, what would you do with it? I blinked, caught off guard. More money? More of anything, she replied. Wealth, time, influence. What would you do if you had it? The question settled between us like a stone dropped in still water. I thought for a moment, tracing the rim of my cup with my thumb. I suppose I'd help people. Maybe start something. A place that makes life easier for those who don't have enough. Her smile was small but knowing, like I had given an answer she'd been waiting for. My eyes drifted then, drawn to the far corner of the room. There, against the wall, stood a tall glass cabinet. Inside, lined in neat rows, were velvet boxes, each identical in size and shape, and inside each box, a gold coin, not just one or two. Dozens. They were perfect twins of the one I had picked up from the gutter. The same size, the same faint tarnish, the same weight of history in their gleam. I stared for a moment, my mind spinning with questions. You have a lot of those, I said finally, nodding towards the cabinet. She followed my gaze but didn't turn her head fully, as though the coins were unremarkable to her. Yes. Why so many? Her smile deepened, not in joy, but in that strange, knowing way she had. You've asked the right question, she said softly, but at the wrong time. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, the only sound in the pause that followed. I sipped my tea to fill the silence, the flavor lingering sweet and slightly spiced. But my attention kept pulling back to that cabinet of coins. There was no way they were meaningless. No one kept dozens of identical gold coins unless they were important, unless they were meant for something. Her gaze returned to me, and I realized she had been watching me study them. You're curious, she said. I am, I admitted. But you don't seem ready to explain. Her lips curved again into that patient smile. Some things are better understood after you've seen the rest of the picture. I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain clinking lightly against the saucer. And what picture is that? Instead of answering, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. Tell me, she said, about the hardest choice you've ever made. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment before answering. A story from years ago, one I rarely told, about turning down a job that would have made me comfortable because it came at someone else's expense. She listened closely, her eyes never leaving my face, nodding only once when I finished. Yes, she murmured, almost to herself. I thought so. We spoke for nearly an hour. her questions weaving between my past, my values, my beliefs. Each time I thought we were simply talking, she'd steer the conversation toward something that felt like a test. Not an obvious one, nothing so direct, but a quiet probing, as though she was searching for a truth I hadn't yet named. The teapot grew lighter, the plate of biscuits emptier, but the atmosphere never lost that undercurrent of purpose. I began to realize this wasn't just a visit. It was an evaluation. Finally, she set her cup down with deliberate care. Her fingers lingered on the handle for a second before releasing it, and she leaned forward just slightly, enough for her voice to drop to something softer. "That coin," she said, "was never lost." My breath caught, though I wasn't sure why. Her gaze didn't waver, and in the quiet that followed she added, "It was placed." The words sank in, rippling through me like a stone dropped into deep water. Placed, not dropped, not forgotten. I stared at her, the weight of her meaning settling in slowly. And for the first time, I realized, maybe I hadn't found the coin by chance at all. I had unknowingly stepped into a trial, and passed. What I thought was a random encounter on a quiet street had been something entirely different. Her words peeled back the moment like paper, revealing another reality underneath. The tea in my hands suddenly tasted different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of what she was about to say. "That coin," she said, her gaze steady on mine, "was never lost." The air in the room seemed to hold still for a moment. My fingers tightened around my teacup, the porcelain warm against my skin. She let the words linger, then leaned back slightly in her chair, her voice calm but deliberate. "I placed it there, just as I've placed coins like it in other places, at other times, for many years now." I stared at her, not sure I'd heard correctly. You put it there, on purpose?" "Yes." The corners of her mouth lifted faintly, not in amusement, but in confirmation. And I waited, just as I've waited in many streets, markets, and parks before this one. Waited. "For what?" I asked. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if to decide how much I was ready to hear. "For someone like you," her words sent a quiet shiver down my spine. She lifted her cup, taking an unhurried sip of tea before continuing. "Most people, when they see the coin, do one of two things. They pocket it without a thought, or they leave it where it lies. Rarely, very rarely, someone will pick it up and return it to the nearest person they think it might belong to. That's what you did." I thought back to that day, to the moment I saw her struggling to bend down, her hands trembling. I'd acted without thinking. It hadn't felt like a decision, just instinct. "I didn't do anything special," I said, almost defensive. Her eyes softened, but her tone stayed firm. "To you, perhaps not. But to me, it was everything. Kindness is the rarest form of wealth. Most people only give it when there's something to gain." She set her cup down and rose from her chair with the kind of slow grace that made it seem deliberate. Walking toward the tall glass cabinet in the corner, she retrieved a small key from a chain around her neck. The cabinet's contents gleamed even in the muted afternoon light. Inside were rows of identical velvet boxes, each one cradling a gold coin like the one I had returned to her. I got up and followed her, drawn by the quiet gravity of the display. "This," she said, unlocking the glass door with a soft click, "is my history of the test." Inside, the coins were arranged with precision. Beneath each velvet box was a small card, neatly handwritten with a date, a location, and sometimes a name. I crouched to look closer. "You've kept them all?" "Yes. Each coin represents a person who found it. Most never knew I was watching. Some passed the test, some failed, and only a handful have I invited into my home." I turned to look at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "How many passed?" Her smile was tinged with something that felt like both pride and sadness. "Fewer than you'd hope. Far fewer." She closed the cabinet door gently and returned to her seat. I followed, my mind still turning over the idea of a test I hadn't even known I was taking. When I sat down again, she folded her hands in her lap and leaned slightly forward. "Do you know why I look for people like you?" I shook my head. "Because I've learned," she said, her voice low and steady, "that the world changes one person at a time. I can't give kindness to everyone, but I can find those who will carry it forward." Her words hit something deep in me, something I didn't know was waiting to be stirred. We sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the mantel clock filling the room. The smell of cinnamon lingered in the air, mixing with the faint floral scent of the tea. Finally, she reached for her cup again, but didn't drink. Instead, she asked, "If you had more than you needed, money, time, influence, what would you do with it?" It wasn't the first time she'd asked me something like that, but this time, the question felt heavier. I thought for a moment. I'd help people. Start something. Maybe a place that offers what people can't afford: food, medicine, education. Something that lasts. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, as if she'd been waiting for that exact answer. "Yes," she murmured. "I thought so." She leaned back then, studying me for a long moment, her eyes calm but probing. I felt exposed under her gaze, like she could see not just who I was, but what I could become, for better or worse. And then, she said it. "You passed my test. And now, I want to offer you something." The room seemed to grow smaller around us. "What kind of something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. "Something that will change your life," she said simply. "In ways you might not expect. In ways you might not want." The air between us felt charged now, like the moment before a storm breaks. "What if I don't accept?" I asked. Her eyes didn't waver. "Then you'll leave here today, go back to your life, and this will become a strange memory you revisit on quiet nights. But you'll always wonder. You'll wonder why I chose you, and what would have happened if you'd said yes." Her words landed with a quiet finality that made my pulse quicken. I didn't speak. I just watched her trace the rim of her cup with one fingertip, the faint rasp of porcelain under her nail somehow loud in the stillness. Then she set the cup down and leaned in, her voice dropping until it was almost a whisper. "I have something for you," she said, her eyes holding mine. "But you may not want it." The clock ticked once, twice, and I felt the air shift, as if the house itself was listening. And in that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't yet name. This was not about money. It was about a mission. The air in the room still carried the echo of her last words, as if the walls had absorbed them. Her gaze was steady, her posture unshaken, like someone who had rehearsed this moment for a long time. And in that stillness, I realized whatever she was about to tell me would redraw the lines of my life. Her fingers tapped lightly against the porcelain cup before she spoke. "My name," she said slowly, "is Evelyn Harcourt." The name meant nothing to me at first, but the way she said it, with quiet authority, told me it should. She went on. "I am a widow. My husband passed away nearly 20 years ago. We had no children, no family close enough to inherit what we built together." Something in her tone shifted then, softened. "I have lived quietly since then. Some people collect houses. Some collect art. I've collected opportunities, the right investments, the right moments, the right people." I sat still, absorbing her words, but my mind was racing. She reached into a small drawer in the sideboard and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward me. The leather was worn, the edges smooth from years of handling. "Inside," she said, "are the details of a project I've been dreaming of for a long time." I hesitated before opening it. The first page held photographs, children in worn clothes, smiling in spite of their surroundings, a crumbling community center, a closed-down clinic with a faded sign. As I flipped through, I saw maps, blueprints, lists of names and needs. There were plans for new buildings, supply routes, and outreach programs. "This," she said, tapping a finger to the folder, "is what I want you to lead." I looked up sharply. "Me?" Her expression didn't waver. "You." My instinct was to laugh, but the seriousness in her eyes froze the sound before it left my throat. "I've never managed anything like this. I don't even know where to start." "You know more than you think," she replied. "You know how to act without thinking only of yourself. You know how to recognize need and respond. Everything else can be learned." I shook my head slightly, overwhelmed. "This is huge. It's not just delivering a meal or donating clothes. This is lives, hundreds of them." "Yes," she said simply. "And I can't trust just anyone with it." She leaned back, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her calmness was unnerving, like she had already decided I would say yes, and now she was only waiting for me to catch up. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. Her gaze didn't falter. "Then I will find someone else. But I will tell you now. I have been searching for years, and I have found very few who pass my test. And of those few, even fewer have the courage to take the next step." I looked down at the folder again. The faces in the photographs stared back at me, some smiling, some weary, all carrying stories I didn't yet know. My pulse was quickening, not just from the pressure of her offer, but from something else. A pull, deep inside, toward the possibility of making a real difference. And yet, alongside it, there was fear. Fear of failing, fear of being the wrong choice, fear of stepping into a role I couldn't handle. She seemed to sense it. "You're afraid," she said softly. I met her eyes. "Yes, I don't want to ruin something this important. That," she replied, "is exactly why you won't." For a moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the mantel. The weight of her words pressed in around me, heavy, but not suffocating. More like the weight of something being placed into my hands with care. Finally I asked, "Why me?" Her smile was faint, but genuine. "Because you didn't see the coin as yours to take. Because you didn't hesitate. Because the kind of heart that returns something small will protect something great." I exhaled slowly, my gaze dropping back to the folder. The maps and plans blurred slightly as my mind tried to picture what this would mean. The places I'd have to go, the people I'd have to meet, the problems I'd have to solve. She reached across the table then, her hand resting lightly over mine. "I will provide the resources, the connections, the funding. You will provide the will, the leadership, the heart. Together, we can do more than either of us could alone." Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried an intensity that told me this was more than a request. It was a calling. I sat there for what felt like a long time, the decision forming slowly inside me. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to leap at the chance to be part of something so meaningful. Another part wanted to retreat to the safety of my ordinary life, where my mistakes wouldn't ripple outward to touch so many others. I thought about the coin, the test, the way she had been searching for people like me for years. And I thought about what it would mean to walk away from this moment, knowing I had been chosen and had refused. Her voice broke through my thoughts, quiet, but steady. "This is not about money," she said. "It is about the kind of legacy you want to leave behind. Once you begin, there's no going back. You will see things you can't unsee, and you will be changed, whether you want to be or not." Her words sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't tell if it was fear or anticipation. She closed the folder, sliding it back toward me as though sealing the decision inside it. "Once you begin," she warned again, her gaze holding mine, "there's no going back." The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the choice I made here would echo for the rest of my life. And I realized, the next words out of my mouth might alter my future forever. Her real life existed far from the modest home I first saw. If I had been trying to imagine the kind of place Evelyn Harcourt called her own, I would have failed as miserably, because nothing in my mind could have matched the reality of where she took me the very next day. And by the time the gates closed behind us, I realized I was stepping into a world I didn't even know existed. The morning air was crisp, sunlight streaming across the city streets as she pulled up in a sleek black sedan. "Get in," she said warmly, as though this were just a casual drive. I climbed into the passenger seat, the leather cool against my skin, the faint scent of something floral lingering inside. Not a synthetic air freshener, but the kind of perfume that carried history. We drove in silence at first. The city gradually thinned, buildings giving way to wider streets, then to winding roads framed by rolling hills. Every mile put more space between us and the life I knew. Eventually, the car turned down a narrow road shaded by thick rows of oak and maple trees. Their branches arched overhead like a natural tunnel, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns on the pavement. Then ahead I saw them. Towering wrought iron gates, twice the height of the car, their black bars curled into intricate patterns. They looked old, but not neglected, the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. As we approached, a small security booth came into view. The guard inside stepped out, nodded respectfully to Evelyn, and pressed a button. The gate swung open without a sound, as if even the mechanics had been crafted for elegance. The car rolled forward, and the world beyond the gates opened like a scene from another time. The driveway curved gently, flanked on both sides by perfectly manicured gardens. Lavender, roses, and manicured hedges painted the air with fragrance. We passed marble fountains, some depicting angels, others mythical creatures, their water catching the sunlight in fine sprays. Birds darted between tall trees that formed living walls, keeping the outside world at bay. And then, finally, the mansion came into view. It wasn't just large. It was imposing. White stone walls rose 3 stories high, their surfaces gleaming in the morning light. Rows of tall windows reflected the gardens, while the roofline was crowned with ornate chimneys and sculpted balustrades. The front entrance was framed by grand columns, their bases carved with symbols I didn't recognize. A set of double doors stood at the top of a wide marble staircase, each door so tall I felt like I'd stepped into a storybook. I glanced at Evelyn, but she was calm, her eyes forward, as if this sight was as familiar to her as my own apartment was to me. When the car stopped, a man in a dark suit opened my door. He gave me a polite nod, but said nothing. Inside, the mansion's scale became even more overwhelming. The foyer rose upward in a sweeping dome, its ceiling painted with a mural of a star-lit sky. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, spilling colors across polished marble floors. 2 sweeping staircases curved upward to meet at a balcony, and beneath them, a long hallway stretched into shadow. Evelyn gestured for me to follow. We moved through hallways lined with oil paintings, portraits of people I didn't recognize, each frame as intricate as the gates outside. Their eyes seemed to follow me, watching silently as we passed. Some doors were closed, their handles gleaming, others slightly ajar, offering glimpses into rooms filled with antique furniture and rare books. Then, we stepped into the library. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, not just shelves of books, but entire walls made of glass, looking out over the back gardens. Sunlight spilled in, catching the gold lettering on leather-bound volumes that climbed from floor to ceiling. Rolling ladders stood ready at the ends of each aisle, and plush chairs were tucked into reading corners lit by soft lamps. In the center, a large table held maps, journals, and delicate models of buildings, perhaps tied to the project she had mentioned. I moved toward the glass wall, drawn by the view. Beyond the gardens, I could see the faint glint of water, a lake hidden deep within the estate's grounds. "You built all this?" I asked quietly. Evelyn's smile was small. "Some of it. The rest I've preserved." We left the library and continued down another hallway, this one narrower, the air cooler. At its end stood something unexpected, a large steel vault door. It was out of place among the carved wood and marble, its heavy metal surface broken only by a gleaming handle and a keypad. A man stood beside it, dressed in a tailored black suit. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. Evelyn gave him a single nod. He returned it, but neither spoke. I couldn't stop my curiosity. "What's in there?" She glanced at me, her smile returning, the kind that held more secrets than answers. "Not today." We retraced our steps back toward the library, the silence between us comfortable but charged with something unspoken. I was beginning to realize that every step she took me on was intentional, a breadcrumb trail of impressions and mysteries. At the library door, she paused and looked at me. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm, but her words carried weight. "Tomorrow," she said, "you'll understand why I chose you." The way she said it made it sound less like a promise and more like a warning. And as I left that estate, I couldn't tell if the feeling in my chest was excitement or fear. I was about to learn that kindness can be as heavy as responsibility. Up until that point, kindness had been something I could give freely, a moment in passing, a small act without much weight or lasting consequence. But as I stood beside Evelyn Harcourt that morning, looking over the charred remains of a place that had once been full of life, I began to understand that kindness, when wielded on this scale, became something else entirely. It was no longer a gesture. It was a burden, a commitment, a choice that would echo in the lives of people I hadn't even met yet. We had left the estate early, the sky still painted with the soft colors of dawn. Evelyn drove in silence, her hand steady on the wheel, her focus fixed straight ahead, as though her mind was already in the place we were heading. The city slowly gave way to older neighborhoods, the streets narrower, the buildings closer together, their facades worn and faded. Some windows were boarded up, others were smeared with the marks of time and neglect. There was a heaviness in the air here, the kind that doesn't come from weather, but from years of slow decline. Finally, we turned onto a street where the air smelled faintly of smoke, even though the fire had long been extinguished. Ahead of us stood the skeletal remains of a building, the blackened frame of what had once been a community center. The roof was gone, replaced by open sky, and the walls that remained were streaked with soot, their painted murals now little more than smudged shadows of the bright colors they once held. Evelyn stepped out of the car without a word, and I followed. She stood for a long moment, her eyes scanning every inch of the ruin as if she were seeing it, not as it was now, but as it could be. "This," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying a note of quiet determination, "will be our first project." I turned to her, unsure I'd heard right. Our first mission together," she clarified. "This place was once the heart of this neighborhood. A place where children learned to read, where families gathered, where no one felt like they had to belong to be welcomed. It burned down 6 months ago, and they've had nothing since her gaze shifted to me, sharp but not unkind. I want you to lead the rebuilding." The words landed heavily. "Me?" "Yes. You'll make the decisions. Who to hire, where the funds go, how to bring the community into the process. You'll be the one they see, the one they speak to." I stared at the ruin in front of us. The scale of it felt overwhelming. This wasn't just about putting up walls and a roof. It was about restoring trust, hope, and a sense of belonging to a place that had lost it. "I've never led something like this," I admitted, my voice low. Evelyn's reply was simple. "You've led without realizing it before. This is no different, only bigger." The first day on site was nothing like I expected. The locals watched from a distance, their expressions guarded, their conversations hushed when I walked by. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few openly wary. It was clear they'd seen promises before, promises that never turned into action, promises that faded once the first photo was taken, and the headlines moved on. So, I didn't start with speeches or blueprints. I started with introductions. I walked the street, shaking hands, learning names, listening to stories about the center, the dances that used to be held there, the tutoring sessions, the food drives in the winter. I learned who had been here the longest, who remembered the first time the doors had opened decades ago. Slowly, I began to bring them into the process. We held informal meetings in a nearby cafe, spreading sketches across the tables so they could see what I was imagining and tell me what they wanted. I realized quickly that the project wasn't just about rebuilding walls. It was about building trust in people who had been let down too many times before. Evelyn visited occasionally, always quietly, always standing to the side while I spoke with the residents. She never interrupted, never tried to take the spotlight. When I asked her why, she said, "This is your work to earn. I've chosen you to be the bridge. Now build it." The first physical change came when we cleared the site. Dozens of locals showed up with gloves, shovels, and trash bags. We worked side by side, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, mixing with the scrape of metal and the thud of debris hitting the bins. I noticed how the walls between us began to fall as the walls of the ruined building came down. A woman named Clara, who had lived here all her life, told me stories about the center's early days. "It was the only place that ever felt safe for some of these kids," she said, her voice catching slightly. "If you can bring it back, you'll be giving them more than a building. You'll be giving them a chance." The design meetings became community events. People brought food to share. Children sketched their own ideas for the mural they wanted painted on the new walls. The project began to feel less like mine and more like ours, exactly what Evelyn had intended. And yet, the weight of the responsibility never lessened. I kept meticulous track of the funds, reviewed every contract, double-checked the work being done. The more progress we made, the more I understood that a single bad decision could undo all the trust we'd built. Weeks passed, and the charred remains transformed into the sturdy frame of something new. The roof beams went up, the walls began to take shape, and the day the first coat of bright paint went on, people gathered in the street just to watch. I caught Evelyn standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes on the building, but her expression unreadable. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod, as if to say, "You're doing it." It wasn't until late one evening, after a long day of overseeing deliveries and checking the progress inside, that I began to sense something beneath the surface of all this. Something unspoken. The sun had dipped low, casting the street in amber light. I locked the temporary gate we'd put up around the site and began walking toward my car. That's when I noticed him. A man leaning casually against the corner of a nearby building. He stepped forward as I approached, his expression neutral, but his voice carrying a weight I couldn't place. "You should know who she really is," he said, his eyes steady on mine. The fading sunlight caught his face, just enough for me to see the seriousness there. I froze, the sounds of the street fading into the background. And for the first time since meeting Evelyn Harcourt, I wondered if I truly knew her at all. Even the purest hearts cast long shadows. I had always thought of Evelyn Harcourt as a woman untouched by scandal, someone whose wealth was matched only by her quiet dignity, her ability to focus entirely on the needs of others. But the words I heard that evening, "You should know who she really is," had lodged themselves in my mind like a thorn, impossible to ignore no matter how hard I tried. It didn't matter that they came from a stranger. They had cracked something in me, and now I couldn't help but wonder what truth, if any, they concealed. That night, I barely slept. The warning kept looping in my head, each repetition sharper, heavier, more insistent, who she really is. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe an old grudge. Maybe envy from someone who resented her wealth and influence. People like Evelyn drew both admiration and hostility. It was part of the territory. And yet, the man's voice hadn't carried the tone of malice. It had been steady, quiet, almost reluctant, as though he didn't want to tell me, but felt I needed to know. By morning, my curiosity had curdled into a kind of restless unease. I found myself replaying my interactions with Evelyn, scanning them for signs I might have missed. There were things, now that I thought about it, small details that seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt heavier with potential meaning. She never spoke much about her past, even when conversation brushed up against it. She avoided photographs of her younger years, and though the mansion was filled with portraits, none seemed to be of her or her late husband together. And then there were the rooms she never opened. I had noticed them on my earlier visits to the estate, heavy wooden doors that remained locked or simply closed, even when she gave me tours of the place. If I asked, she would smile faintly and say, "Not much to see in there," before moving on. It hadn't struck me as strange before. After all, people value their privacy. But now it felt different, intentional, perhaps even protective in a way that didn't match the openness she displayed elsewhere. And then there was her desk, a sprawling antique piece in the corner of her study, always immaculate except for a small stack of letters and papers she kept in one locked drawer. I'd seen her unlock it once, quickly slide something inside, and lock it again before returning the key to the chain around her neck. The more I thought about it, the more these pieces began to arrange themselves into a shape I didn't quite recognize. A shape that suggested Evelyn Harcourt's story, as I knew it, might be incomplete. Still, I told myself, suspicion without proof is just paranoia. I needed something tangible before I could allow myself to truly doubt her. That proof, as it turned out, would find me in a way I didn't expect. One evening, Evelyn told me she had an appointment in the city and would be gone until late. She encouraged me to use the library if I wanted, even offering to have dinner brought to me while she was away. The house felt different without her. Quieter, yes, but also less contained, as if her presence normally kept its vastness from swallowing me whole. I wandered the library for a while, running my fingers along the spines of books older than both of us combined, before eventually drifting toward her study. The door was ajar. It wasn't unusual. I had been in there before, but something in the air felt different. Maybe it was the faint smell of her perfume still hanging in the room, or the way the lamplight pooled across the desk, drawing my eye toward the open book lying there. It was a thick leather-bound volume, the kind that might hold genealogies or records of some kind. The pages were slightly yellowed, the edges worn from use. I knew I shouldn't pry, and yet my fingers moved almost of their own accord, turning the cover back further to see what lay beneath. That was when I saw it, a single sheet of paper tucked between the pages, folded in half. It looked old, its edges softened and slightly torn, as though it had been handled many times over the years. I hesitated, my heart beat loud in the stillness of the study, but the pull of it was too strong. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. It was a newspaper clipping. The headline was printed in bold, unforgiving letters, the kind that command attention even decades later. The paper's texture was brittle under my fingertips, but the ink was still sharp enough to read without effort. Millionaire widow survives home invasion that killed husband. For a moment, the words didn't fully register. My eyes scanned them, but my mind refused to make sense of what I was seeing. When it did, a rush of questions flooded in at once, tangling together so fast I could barely keep track of them. A home invasion. A husband killed. Evelyn surviving. And if this was true, why had she never spoken of it? Why had she never even hinted at something so defining, so traumatic? I sat back in her chair, staring at the clipping, my pulse quickening. The edges of the paper fluttered slightly in my trembling hands. Was this the tragedy the man had meant? Was this the shadow Evelyn had been living under all this time? Or was there more to it than what the headline suggested? Because if there was one thing I had learned about Evelyn Harcourt by now, It was that nothing in her life, not even a simple gold coin, was ever just what it appeared to be. The headline burned itself into my mind. Millionaire widow survives home invasion that killed husband. I folded the clipping back into the book, but the weight of it didn't leave my hands. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed, the sound startlingly loud in the stillness, and I realized I had just stepped into the darkest part of Evelyn's story, whether I was ready for it or not. Her fortune was built on loss, survival, and fierce resolve. The headline from the clipping had burned itself into my thoughts all night, replaying every time I closed my eyes, every time silence stretched too long. By morning, it wasn't just a piece of her past. It was a presence, a shadow in the room, following me from one thought to the next. And I knew I couldn't keep carrying it without asking her what it really meant. When Evelyn arrived the next day, she found me in the library. I hadn't meant to wait for her there, but I wanted the familiarity of the books around me, something steady and unchanging to anchor me for what I was about to do. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning my face in that way she did, as though she could read my thoughts without me saying a word. "You found something," she said. It wasn't a question. I hesitated, then held out the clipping. "In one of your books." She didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she walked to the window, the light catching the silver in her hair, before finally turning back and taking the paper from my hand. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Her fingers traced the edge of the brittle sheet, her eyes scanning the familiar words as if they were being read for the first time. Then she said quietly, "They made it sound so simple in the paper. Home invasion, robbery, gone wrong." She set the clipping down on the table, the weight of her gaze shifting back to me. It was never simple. She told me the story slowly, each word deliberate. It was winter. Late. We'd just returned from a dinner in the city. The house was locked, the alarms set. I remember thinking how warm it felt inside compared to the snow outside. My husband was in his study, pouring a drink. I went upstairs to change. Her voice wavered slightly, but she kept going. I heard a crash. At first I thought he'd dropped a glass. Then, shouting. Not his voice. She described moving toward the stairs, the way her heart pounded when she heard a second man's voice. Rough, angry, demanding money and jewelry. She'd frozen, listening to the sound of drawers being opened, the clatter of objects hitting the floor. Then came the sound she could never forget, the single, deafening gunshot. Her breath hitched, and I felt my own chest tighten in response. I didn't run down. I ran into the nearest guest room, locked the door, and called the police. I stayed there, listening to footsteps below. Then silence. Then, the sound of the front door slamming. By the time the police arrived, her husband was gone. The killer, a man with a long history of violent crimes, was caught days later, still in possession of her husband's watch and wallet. "He confessed," she said, her voice hardening. "And still, it didn't give me back what I lost." She withdrew from public life after that, sold the city property, lived quietly. For years, she avoided the parties, the charities, the circles she used to move in so effortlessly. "It wasn't grief alone that kept me away," she added. "It was the way people looked at me, with pity, or curiosity, or suspicion. I couldn't bear it. When she finally re-emerged, it wasn't to resume her old life. It was to start something new. That's when I began placing the coins," she explained. "Not just any coin, each one a marker. I'd leave them in plain sight, in places where people had a choice, keep it or return it. Most walked away. Some pocketed it. A few," her gaze softened, "a few brought it back." It wasn't random. She kept records, names, dates, locations. She wanted to find people who acted without expectation of reward, who could see value in something simply because it belonged to someone else. "When I met you," she said, I knew you didn't see the coin as an opportunity for yourself. You saw it as a responsibility. Her eyes locked onto mine then, sharp but not cold. You've been wondering why I chose you for this work, she said. It wasn't chance. It wasn't because I needed help. It was because I needed someone whose heart would not be corrupted by what I'm building. And I believe you are that person. I didn't know what to say. My mind was still tangled in the image of her younger self, hiding in a locked room, hearing the gunshot, emerging to find her life changed forever. Part of me wanted to apologize for finding the clipping, for opening a wound that clearly still hurt. Another part was relieved to finally understand the gravity of the person I was working with. I finally asked, "Why not tell me from the start?" Her answer came without hesitation. Because people see what they expect when they know your story. They decide what you are before you've even spoken. I needed you to see me for what I am now, not for what happened to me then. She picked up the clipping again, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into her pocket. Then she stepped closer, her eyes never leaving mine, and said, "Now you know why I chose you." The words carried both weight and finality, like a door closing on one chapter and opening on another. I felt a shift inside me, not just in how I saw her, but in how I saw the work ahead. Because now I understood. This wasn't just her mission anymore. It was ours. I thought the coin was her greatest gift. I was wrong. From the moment she placed that small, tarnished piece of gold into my hand, I believed it was the symbol of everything she wanted to teach me. Kindness, trust, the quiet ways we can change lives without expecting anything in return. But as it turned out, the coin had been nothing more than the invitation to a much greater responsibility, one I had never imagined I would be asked to bear. And on that final evening at her estate, I would learn just how far she was willing to trust me. The invitation came in her usual understated way. No grand announcement, no urgent tone, just a short call the night before. "Come by tomorrow afternoon," she said, her voice softer than usual. "There's something I want you to see before we go any further." I didn't ask what it was. I'd learned by now that Evelyn Harcourt revealed her intentions only when she was ready, and never a moment before. Still, I couldn't help but feel a low hum of anticipation as I drove through the familiar tree-lined road toward the towering iron gates. The estate was quiet that day, the kind of stillness that makes you lower your voice even when there's no one around to overhear. Evelyn met me at the door herself, dressed in a deep emerald coat that made her silver hair shine in the filtered light. There was something in her eyes, a mix of resolve and weariness, that told me this visit would not be like the others. She didn't linger in the foyer or offer tea. Instead, she gestured for me to follow her down the west corridor, past the grand library and the locked rooms I'd come to know so well, until we reached the end of the hall. The vault door. I had seen it before, towering solid steel, guarded day and night by a man in a dark suit who never spoke unless spoken to. I had always wondered what was behind it, had imagined treasures and valuables, heirlooms worth fortunes. Today, the guard stepped aside as Evelyn approached. She slipped a small brass key from the chain around her neck and inserted it into a hidden slot beside the keypad. With a quiet mechanical click, the locking mechanism disengaged, and the massive door swung inward on silent hinges. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with paper and cedar. The room was not at all what I expected. There were no gold bars stacked neatly in rows, no glittering jewels on display. Instead, the walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves sat dozens, maybe hundreds, of plain, unmarked folders. A single table stood in the center of the room, lit by a low-hanging lamp that cast warm circles of light onto its polished surface. Evelyn walked to it slowly, her steps deliberate, and from her pocket she pulled another key, smaller, more delicate, and pressed it into my hand. "This," she said quietly, "is the last key I will ever give you." Her fingers lingered on mine for a moment before letting go. The metal felt warm from her touch, yet impossibly heavy for its size. I looked at her, waiting for an explanation, but she only nodded toward a large cabinet against the far wall. The lock clicked open easily, and I pulled the door wide. Inside were stacks of folders, just like the ones on the shelves, but these were labeled in elegant handwriting. Each folder bore the name of a place, small towns, struggling neighborhoods, remote villages. Beneath each name, a single phrase, "Proposed Project." I took the first one and opened it carefully. Inside was not a vague idea or half-formed charity concept. It was a complete plan. Detailed architectural sketches, line-by-line budgets, lists of potential suppliers, and notes about the local needs. It was, essentially, a fully mapped path to rebuilding or creating something vital for each community. I opened another, and another. They were all the same. Schools, clinics, community centers, shelters. Every one of them ready to be started tomorrow, if someone simply took the reins. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Decades," she said simply. "Every time I learned of a place in need, I began the process. Sometimes I completed the work myself, sometimes I could not. But I kept the plans ready, waiting for the right hands to carry them forward." Her gaze softened. I've spent a lifetime searching for those hands. The weight of what she was showing me settled slowly, like a snowfall that at first seems delicate, and then reveals its depth. This is more than I thought," I admitted. "More than I think I can." "You can," she interrupted gently, "because you have already proven that you act without calculation, without asking first what you might gain. That is the only kind of person who can do this work honestly." She moved closer, and her hand brushed the stack of folders. "These are my life's work. The fortune I built, the resources I gathered, they are all meant for this. And now, they are yours." I looked at her then, really looked, at the fine lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders carried both grace and fatigue, the quiet steadiness of someone who had long since stopped needing recognition. She was not giving me money. She was giving me missions, not comfort, but responsibility. And in some strange, humbling way, it felt like the greatest gift I had ever been offered. "They're yours now," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And so is the responsibility." The key in my hand suddenly felt like the heaviest thing I had ever held. Because in that moment, I knew my life had just been rewritten again, and there would be no turning back. One small act had started a ripple. Now it was a wave. When I had knelt down in that gutter months ago, placing a single gold coin into the trembling hand of an elderly woman, I could never have imagined that moment would unravel into something so vast, so life-changing. I had thought it ended with gratitude. I had thought it was just one more quiet kindness in a lifetime of small ones. But Evelyn Harcourt had taught me that true kindness was never small. It only appeared that way at first, until time revealed its reach. The first months after she handed me the key to her vault were a blur of motion. We didn't waste a single day. Under her watchful guidance, I began bringing the projects to life, one folder at a time. The first was a clinic in a rural town where the nearest hospital was 3 hours away. The ground was rocky, the logistics complicated, but the moment we opened the doors and the first child received care without cost, I understood exactly what Evelyn had been working toward. From there, it was a school in a struggling city neighborhood, then a women's shelter in a remote coastal village battered by storms. Each project came with its own set of challenges: local politics, tight timelines, unexpected expenses. And each time I thought the obstacles might be too much, Evelyn reminded me that this work was never meant to be easy. "Impact," she would say, "comes from persistence, not convenience." I began to see that the coin she had placed in my hand was more than a test. It was a seed, planted to see if I would nurture it into something greater. The story of what we were building began to spread, first through word of mouth, then through local newspapers, and eventually across national headlines. I never sought attention, but reporters were drawn to the unusual nature of it. A mysterious woman who placed coins in public, and the stranger she chose to carry on her work. Before long, the phone began ringing with offers from donors, architects, and volunteers. People from around the world wanted to help, not just with money, but with time, skills, and ideas. And so the ripple grew into a wave. Years passed in a rhythm of creation: plan, build, open, move to the next. But no matter how far the work reached, I never let go of the first reminder. The coin remained framed on my desk, its gold surface catching the light each morning. Whenever the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm me, I would glance at it and remember. It had all started with a single choice to care. Then came the day I had long known would arrive, but had never truly prepared for. Evelyn's health began to fade. She slowed, not in mind, but in body, though she still insisted on visiting the projects when she could. On her last public outing, she walked through the finished halls of a new library we had built together. She ran her hand along the spines of the books, smiling faintly. "This," she told me, "is how you live forever. Not in stone, but in the lives you change." When she passed, the world she had quietly touched seemed to pause. Letters poured in from every corner of the globe, people who had been helped directly or inspired to start their own acts of kindness because of her. Her funeral was small, by her own request, but the faces there reflected a legacy larger than any monument could hold. Children who had grown up in the homes she had built, teachers whose classrooms existed because of her funding, families who had found safety in her shelters. A few weeks later, I found myself driving to the cemetery on a bright, wind-swept morning. The path to her grave wound between rows of old oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I carried a bouquet of fresh lilies, her favorite, and the framed coin from my desk. Kneeling at her headstone, I traced her name with my fingertips. It was carved in simple letters, exactly as she had wanted. I set the flowers beside the stone and unhooked the frame from the coin. Holding it in my palm again after so many years, I felt the same weight I had that first day. Not physical, but something deeper, heavier. The wind moved softly through the grass as I placed it at the foot of her headstone. Ending. "Your heart lives on through every life we touch," I whispered, my voice catching. For a moment I thought I felt her beside me, that quiet presence I had come to trust, guiding me still. Then the wind rose, carrying the scent of lilies away, and I stood, knowing the wave she had started would never break. Because it wasn't just her mission anymore. It was mine, and it would go on for as long as there was someone, somewhere, who needed to be reminded that kindness was never wasted. If this story touched your heart, imagine the journeys still waiting to be told. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next life-changing twist. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice is part of this story, too. And if you believe in the power of kindness, share this video to let the ripple grow.